This is going to try to get you into the mindset and try to get you into working through the methodologies that most pen testers use and trying to break away from I want technical exploit to get access to everything. So we're going to take a look at the human factors. We're going to look at some best practices, some vulnerabilities and stuff outside of technical stuff, and how to build on that and actually break into the hands-on stuff. So a little bit about me. I've been doing this for a long time. I actually started my own security infosec company when I was 17 and I was still in high school. So I've been doing this professionally for about 13 years now. I spent a good amount of time in the PCI space. I like to call it doing time because it's more focused on very scoped segments, very limited things that you can and can't do, and it's not really that fun. Love the social engineering stuff and physical security. If you're not familiar with it, Tool is a fantastic organization if you want to learn how to lockpick, stuff like that. So some of the cons that I've been...
Your slides are a little bit cut off on the left.
Can we do something? Is it signal? All right, give me 1 second here. See if that's any better. Cool? Everybody can see that? All right. So I've done a lot of these conferences. In particular, I'm a big proponent for BSides. Make sure you attend these things. These things are free. Go out and talk at these things. I don't want to be the guy standing up here all the time. I want to hear you guys. Take part in these conferences. That's what makes these things so good. You guys probably have ideas that you want to see up here, and other people want to see those things too. Be up here next time. I really want to see everybody else up here besides myself. I don't really like to hear myself talk that much. I lie, but some of the publications that I've done, I've been doing a lot of these over the last couple of years. In particular, last year I did about 11, 13, somewhere in there, conferences, and have a couple of different presentations that I've done. And later on this year, I got a book coming out with the same title as this talk. So you can check for that later. Enough personal plugs. How many people are familiar with what really a pen test is and the purposes of a pen test, things like that? Yes? Nay? Nay? All right, cool. I won't have to cover this too much. So basically the idea behind a pen test is to make sure that you have somebody take a look at your environment, whether it's infrastructure, physical, technical, best practices, social engineering, whatever it is, to get a good idea of what an attacker is actually going to be able to gain access to. This can be either leveraging, like I said, the social engineering stuff, the person-to-person. This could be leveraging technical vulnerabilities. This can be leveraging a lot of different things. The idea is to get an idea of what a potential attacker or malicious user could gain access to. So pen tests are really valuable in particular because it'll get you the ability to focus on something specific if you're looking for that. If you want to do web app testing, if you want to do network level testing, if you want to do something that's more of the human-based factor, you can scope a pen test. You can get an idea of what is applicable to that specific system or technology. It's also a good way to make sure that later on, in particular, if a breach or something does happen, that you can make sure that you've taken good steps, that the organization isn't going to end up with major fines, et cetera, or if they do end up with them, it's going to be limited to whatever the actual data was that left. So a couple types of testing. There's white box testing, black box testing, and then obviously a hybrid of the two. Depending on the scope and depending on the application, depends on what is a recommended way to approach this. White box testing obviously is going to be where you have everything laid out ahead of your time. You know exactly what you're going to touch. These are mostly your compliance style audit or compliance style pen tests. They'll tell you exactly what you can and can't touch, where they are, how to get to them, and everything like that. Whereas the black box testing gets you a much more real world example of what a potential attacker or malicious user could gain access to, but it takes a lot of time. It can cost a lot of money, and most organizations just don't want to dump that kind of investment into a pen test. So most organizations will pick a hybrid of this, where you start to get a little bit more information, whether you focus on internal, external, etc. So getting into a little bit of the methodology, and I'm gonna spend a little bit of time on the best practices, the methodology, and why this is important, and then we'll start to break into more of the hands-on technical stuff and start walking through the process of how to actually do this stuff. So the methodology is important because if you're familiar, anybody familiar with PTES? Cool, a couple hands. It really gets just a standard out there for how you can actually do pen tests, and then it can be reproducible later on. So the ability to make sure that you're going through each steps can also give you a good quality in the way that you're going to actually have a pen test done. So obviously first you're going to start with your reconnaissance stuff. This is where you're going to start to get your intelligence. This is where you're going to start getting the nuts, get more information about the nuts and bolts of what you're actually going to touch. Then from there, you're going to start doing scanning and VA. This is where you're going to mix between passive and active reconnaissance, start doing port scans, vulnerability enumeration, things like that. And then finally, you're going to progress into the actual exploitation phase. And then because the value of it isn't really the actions that you're doing, it's that report that you're going to hand to your client afterwards. That report is what they're going to gauge not only your abilities to actively do the exploitation, but also are going to gain the return on investment and actually make sure that next time that they come through and want to do a pen test, that they want you to come out and do it. Because if they can't read the information and follow everything that you're doing, it had no value. If they can't fix it, it's not going to secure anybody. All that work that was done isn't going to go anywhere. So reconnaissance, this is where you start doing your information gathering. This is going to be your passive and active stuff. This is going to be your who is information, your dig information, a lot of that stuff. Some of the tools out there, I'll do it where they'll start to branch from one piece of information to the next and really give you the full idea of what's out there and what's available to the internet. And then you get your vulnerability assessment and your network survey. This is where you take that information and we'll actively start to figure out what could potentially be leveraged. This is where you're going to start seeing your correlation for Metasploit packages. This is where you're going to start seeing correlation for code or releases out there, whether it's Core or Metasploit or any of the other vulnerability assessment scanners out there. This is where you're going to start getting the nuts and bolts and figure out whether you're going to end up having to spend 2 days on something or if you're going to spend an hour on something to figure out if you can actually get a shell or root or whatever you have, or depending on the system. And then we start going into the process of verifying whether that information is actually going to be valid for that. So a lot of times you'll start seeing false positives in vulnerability assessment tools. This is where you're actively going to start testing. This is where you start moving into the exploitation phase and really get into the fun stuff. And then password attacks. The reason that I actually pull this out now is because personally as a pen tester, I don't really do password cracking anymore. The ability to do so takes a lot of time, takes a lot of processor power, and in a functional level, you don't really have to do it that much anymore. And I'll actually start to touch on it once we start getting into the hands-on about what's called pass the hash. Anybody familiar? Okay, a couple hands, cool. So the ability to actually gain access to hosts without ever having to crack the password. It saves a lot of time. It is really cool in slides, and when you start telling organizations that you never had to touch their passwords or crack their passwords or anything, they start to get a little bit scared, and whether it's fear or not, it does actually start to impress upon the point that it's imperative to deploy some of the security tools, security utilities, and monitoring stuff. And then finally, reporting and analysis. This is that key. All that stuff, all those hours, whether it was a 1-week engagement, a 2-hour engagement, or a 6-month engagement, if you can't put it into writing so that someone from not only the testers, the people out there in the trenches, can understand it, but also the executives and the management can understand it, that's where you're going to start seeing people coming back to you time after time after time to make sure that you're the one that's actually doing those tests. If you can't translate that information so that those people can read it in clear English, again, it loses that value. So to touch a little bit about tools, some of the tools out there, these can be open source, these can be purchase tools, these can be a lot of different things. In particular on the board here, we've got Multigo. Anybody familiar? Cool, a couple hands. Really good utility for getting information about doing passive analysis. This is going to get a lot of your who is information, start to tie machines to each other. And then Nexpose is a vulnerability assessment management tool. I don't really push products or anything throughout, but you'll see this actually come up later on. I like Nexpose over some of the other utilities just because of the direct relation to Metasploit. And then that brings us actually to Metasploit. I hope that we have a good number of hands. Who's familiar with Metasploit? There we go. So Metasploit is the actual exploitation framework. It's got a lot of packages built in. It's recently been acquired, well, fairly recently been acquired, and now not only has community support, but also has actual corporate R&D dollars being invested into it. And then you have things like Cane Enable and Nmap to start doing some of your network level stuff. And you'll see where kind of each one of these starts to tie in as we move forward here. And this is where we actually start getting into. So that was all the bland, informational stuff. The next part is where we start actually applying these type of methodologies, this type of understanding to an engagement. So the first thing is obviously when you actually start defining your scope and you start looking at those SOWs and what you're actually going to be testing, what are you going to start looking for and what is the importance for some of this stuff? So in particular, make sure you have permission. This is a key thing. If you do not have permission to touch a machine, even if you're in an engagement and it's a third party, do not touch that unless you engage with the owner. This will not only save your butt later on, but it could potentially keep you from owing people fines. So it's very important to make sure that you have permission to touch any of the machines that you're going to later on. And then understanding whether your having that scope is for an internal, external, perchance what the objective is. If they're looking specifically to have PCI information or HIPAA information or something like that, if you as a tester have a clear understanding of what that goal is, you'll be able to apply your methods and apply the things that you learn to focus on stuff. Unlike most of the malicious attackers and open attackers out there, they have as much time as they want to dedicate to this stuff. They can put in weeks, months, whatever. For most of us pen testers, we only have X number of hours that we can fit all this stuff in. So by understanding what the goal of that pen test is, really make sure that the quality of work and your focus and your efforts are not going to be wasted. And then you also want to make sure that if there's anything that's not a standard test, that you clarify that ahead of time. So most of the times, organizations don't really want to test whether they can fall to a denial of service. Or if they do, during business hours is a bad time to test that. So making sure that you clarify if you're going to do something off of the norm or something that could potentially bring down a system, that you want to make sure that those are in clear testing hours. Not only that, you want to make sure that if anything does happen, you have somebody on the line that can directly restart the machine, bring that back up, because if you get a call from a C-level later on the next day and they were down for 6 hours because you didn't get a hold of somebody, they're not going to be happy, so to say the least. And then make sure that, again, you have that emergency list. This is usually going to be your emails, phone number, somebody to get on the phone with at 2 a.m. in the morning when you're doing your testing, that to say, hey, I've got a machine. I know it's still live out there. I probably have something that's running. I just can't talk to it anymore. Can you restart that box? Because, again, if you can't get to it, active users probably can't get to it. And then there's also depending on the type of engagement, depends on who's going to know about what's going on. So sometimes that engagement, and this is good to be clarified during that objective, is whether you're going to test the knock. Say you want to see what the reaction times are, or you want to make sure that an IDS or IPS or something that you put in is actually working. versus just I want to know what's out there. Because if you want to just know what's out there, you're probably going to cause a lot of network traffic. You're going to be noisier. It's also going to give you the ability to either hone whatever your skill set is and focus on, again, whatever that objective is. And then make sure that, especially if you're doing social engineering, don't use real third parties. I'm not speaking from experience or anything, but they just don't like getting email responses from social engineering emails going, well, your bank account has been, manipulated in some way. Financial institutions particularly, they don't like that. Because when they respond to that email, if they respond to an actual financial institution, there's a whole lot of things that go on in the back end that you will have to deal with later. And then, again, make sure that if you're on an engagement, and most of the time you'll run into this in application level stuff, if you start branching over to other websites, because you have Google Analytics or something else built in, make sure that you don't go outside of that scope. Or if you find something that could potentially be leveraged to gain access to another provider, engage them. Make sure that you engage your point of contact, your project manager, and move in that way. Don't just go off the cuff and start going against this stuff. They don't like that. So the first thing that we start doing is we're going to start looking at how to find what's available. So we know we have this scope. We have Class C, Class B, whatever. Start digging down. And the first thing that we're going to start doing is we're going to start running some discovery stuff. So in particular, I use Nmap a lot. A lot of the stuff that I use is still the old command line stuff. I like how it looks. It works a lot better for me instead of going to the GUIs. I will show some of the GUI stuff later just because it's pertinent now, but I prefer being in the terminal. So you can use Nmap to basically get a better idea of what's out there listening. So now you have your Class C, you have your range. Just kind of get an idea of what's actually out there listening. So you don't have to spin your wheels running a VA against Class C, because VAs take a longer time than a discovery scan does or a port scan. You can also do this now in Metasploit. So this is the Metasploit community or /pro edition. So the newest version of Metasploit actually has a web UI that's pretty good. You'll see this a lot through the slides. I won't push Metasploit Pro on here or anything. I do work for Rapid7, but so you can actually do a scan directly from Metasploit, and the back end of this is actually Nmap. So you can put your custom scan switches and such right into the web UI. And whatever it is, whether you want to use a triple V and actually see what Nmap's doing so that it doesn't tell you that it's counting up for your expected completion time, or if you want to start doing specific ports or anything like that, it's broken out for you right within Metasploit now. And the ability to scan through that will get you a good idea as far as what's listening, the types of ports, and what the potential for services or whatever's running on that. And if you're running it in Nmap, this is the Metasploit. This is the actual output for that. So you can follow it live within the log window and see just exactly what you would see normally in a terminal window if you were running Nmap. And it kind of makes it for anybody that wants to see what's actually being done and make sure that that scan's actively running properly for what you know Nmap should be doing. You can verify that right here. And then the next part is to go into vulnerability assessment. So now we understand that our Class C is now down to 100 IPs, 75 IPs. So we want to focus on that. Because the first thing now for me personally, one of my goals is if I go into an engagement, I want root in 24 hours. That's a short amount of time when you're on an actual engagement. Because you have to make sure that if it's an on-site, you're working in a certain amount of hours and such. So I want to make sure that everything that I'm doing is going to cut that the amount of time that I have to focus on each effort down to whatever the minimum I possibly can. Metasploit now gives you the ability to directly import from a lot of different VAs out there. You can do an import from Nessus, you can do an import from Nexpose, you can do an import from Nmap, you can do an import from a lot of these different devices directly into Metasploit. So in particular, because Metasploit the community edition, as well as an Expos community edition tied directly into one another, you can run a VA scan from Metasploit in Expos, and all that information is going to be directly imported into Metasploit without having you do any sort of other interactions. It cuts down the amount of time, and it makes the information show up pretty quickly. So it runs just like any other VA out there. You'll start to see the information. It'll start to correlate any known Metasploit packages directly into the data that's going to be returned per host. And it'll start taking a look at what the potential for those for exploits are. So it's going to either match up a Metasploit module, it's going to match up a known exploit on a CVE or security focus listing, and it's going to start giving you the information. This cuts down on that amount of time that you have to start guessing. If you had a Google search for every service that you found based on banner, could you imagine how long that would take you? You're not going to get that done in the scope of an engagement. If you have even 10 machines and you have to Google search 1,000 different ports and services, if you can do that in an engagement, I give you props. I will buy you a drink. And the next thing that I'll move to is while I have the VA stuff going, I'll start moving and start looking at some of the other stuff. Now, I like to look at the man in the middle. Some organizations, you'll have to initiate them to say, I want to do this because there is potential that you can knock machines offline and such. But if you cater that and you understand what you're doing when you're executing it, you can lessen the likelihood. So I particularly like Cain and Abel. You can do this with EtterCap. You can do this with a number of other utilities. But Cain and Abel seems to do it functionally the best that I like, as well as gives you the best look and the easiest way to actually dig through some of the data that you're seeing. So in this screen right here, we actually have Cain and Abel up. And what I did was I did a populate for and a scan for any of the devices listing out there. So you can see that it lists the IP address, the MAC address, and then who the manufacturer is. In this way, you can now cater your man in the middle, and you can also start catering some of your later attacks. Because if you see Kyocera up there, that's probably a printer. So you're not going to run Microsoft exploits against a printer or a print server. You're not going to run those off of a fax machine. You start building and taking these little pieces of information, and you start shortening the amount of time that you actually have to focus on the outside portions of the engagement. So now every one of these little steps, you start shortening the amount of time that it's going to take you to actually get to the point of getting to root. So while I've got my man in the middle running, I might have 15 machines. I've got my VA stuff going. I'm still going to be churning. I want to get that root in that 24 hours. That's my key goal. And if I can get that root in 24 hours, I can spend the rest of the time making sure that I have pertinent information, pertinent evidence, all that fun stuff, and making sure that not only is the report easy to read, but there's cool, pretty pictures in there. Because everybody likes pictures, right? Yes? It's not rhetorical. Yell. Yes. Yes? No? Nobody likes pictures. All right. So when I start looking at the exploitation phase, I'm not going to be only focusing on the system level stuff, because the system level stuff, a lot of times you have other systems that support those, whether it's using WSUS or something like that for doing patch management, or IDS IPS for making sure that all the network systems. That's not going to be usually what's going to be leveraged when you start getting into the point of exploitation. It's starting to look at the low-hanging stuff. I know that, in particular, most of the engagements on there that I've been on, if I have a workstation segment in the scope, there's probably going to be more vulnerabilities on the workstation environment than there's going to be in the server environment, because servers are critical systems, right? So everybody applies good patch management and everything to servers, but usually the workstations elapse a little bit. And then to look at human input, usually the human aspect is the weakest link. You start applying best practices and security across what people can and can't do, and you start seeing people start trying to get workarounds in there. Whether it's shared passwords, whether it's changes of passwords by only a character, could be a number, changing 1 to 2 because you had to change your password at 30 days. So if you change that under Windows, if you change that 1 to a 2, that's a different password. So and then the administrators usually want things to be easy. The cost of support and management for organizations today is astronomical when you actually start looking into what you have to spend for it. Because that's people, that's systems, that's various technologies, that's support across multiple platforms. All that stuff costs money. So to cut down the amount of time and money that it takes means that there's going to be shortcuts in there somewhere. And those shortcuts are usually going to be administration level stuff. Who's familiar with MSO 8067? Oh, I should see more hands than that. Configure? Anybody know Configure? Yes. I use this, and I will say probably 97% of the engagements that I've been on has at least gotten me onto one system. So the ability to, and this is, if you look at the 08, means that came out in 2008. This is 4 years later. This stuff still exists. Usually you'll find this on a Windows XP box somewhere out there in a workstation segment. It doesn't really apply to a lot of the server stuff unless they're legacy boxes, you know, your 95s, your 2000s. And if you're running on anything later than that, you're probably owned already. So you can use the MS08 067 in the web UI. You can use it in classic Metasploit. Doesn't matter. Everything that you're going to see through these whole walkthroughs are applicable to both. So whether it's in the web UI or whether it's in the command line, everything that we're going to walk through and everything that I'm going to actually show the exploits for can be applied to both. So it doesn't matter whether you have framework and you're working on Ubuntu or even an old school BT3 Slackware box. As long as you've got Metasploit updated, this stuff works. So the first thing is to look for MS08 067. Nice thing about using the UI is that you can actually define a range. So you can actually put in your full CIDR range and look for an MS08 067 to pop a shell throughout an entire environment. And when you run it for the web UI, it'll actually pop a number in the sessions right at the top. If you're in the terminal, it'll just generate yourself an interpreter session right there when you actually execute it. And then once you have that, you can actually see on the screen that it'll define that MS08 was actually the exploit. So this right here, this is going to exploit against the Windows XP box for our little lab environment that we're going to walk through. And by having this information, we've already got a foothold into the infrastructure. And then the next thing is actually start gathering credentials. Now, if you remember, we still have that man in the middle running. And if you're running a man in the middle, there's a lot of things that you'll see. You'll see HTTP traffic, HTTPS. Now you're able to actually do some SSL stripping and such. You'll see Telnet, you'll see SSH, you'll see a lot of different protocols start flying over the line. And if you start looking at HTTP stuff, there's a lot of applications out there that will integrate with Windows authentication, or that users generally will use the same password and username for, because it's easy to remember. So you'll actually start seeing the traffic from one device to another, and depending on where you actually execute that man in the middle, Cain Enable will nicely populate that in a username and password list for you. So you can literally just scroll through everything that you were watching on the wire and pull out what you need. So this also applies to HTTPS. And I found a number of decently what should be secured information. Some of the credit card companies will fall to SSL stripping. So just generally be careful what you're using. And then you also have the ability to watch SMB connections or Windows logins. So the nice thing about Cain Enable is actually in... There we go. All right, so in Cain Enable, these buttons right here, these top ones right here, allow you to actually downgrade your NTLM to NTLM v1. So it'll spoof the challenge and response that the Windows servers will send out there, and it'll allow you to downgrade. So it'll actually map what type of NTLM credentials and hashes that you're able to collect there. And the nice thing about that is with the newest version of NTLM, it'll actually pad the hash with zeros, whereas if you have the NTLM v1 credentials, or the hash clear text, it'll be the full password. So the way that the SMB connection works is it doesn't pass, obviously, clear text passwords, but it passes the hash itself. And then if we actually have that session, say in the Metasploit UI, we can click collect evidence, and it'll start running Meterpreter sessions if you have a Meterpreter connection, or excuse me, Meterpreter scripts directly from the UI to start collecting the information. And one of the, by default that it's going to pull is it's going to pull the local hashes. And these are based on the SAM database. Everybody familiar with what that is? Yes? Awesome. So the SAM database is a database that holds the hashes for any of the local passwords. In particular, the one that we're looking for is that top one, which is the local administrator password and hash. And the reason that we're looking for that in particular, and here's just kind of a list, is that a lot of times corporations will have a standard corporate build. How many people here, company, has a standard corporate build? All right. So in doing so, there's usually a single local administrator account that is used to install every application that they need to run for that business, right? Most organizations leave that after they connect to the domain. So if you have the ability to gain that information of having one machine on the network that has that username and password hash that you were able to guess or able to collect, the potential is to start actually leveraging that across the whole system. So you can do this whether it's a user account that could be shared across that local. It could be a lot of different things. So again, we're still focusing on local administration hashes, local passwords, and local accounts. The next part is actually the pass a hash technique. Hey, I got to laugh. Cool. You guys are actually reading this stuff. So pass the hash is actually where we take the hash that we were able to collect and populate the password field in a PSExec module. Everybody familiar with PSExec at least? A little bit? It's a utility that way back when actually Microsoft put some dev into, and then sysutils picked it up and such. What it does is it replicates the SMB connection from machine to a machine for Microsoft administration or Windows administration. And it's the PSExec module is built into Metasploit as a whole. And if you find, let's see here. So in what we're walking through here is we're going to go into our host. We're going to find that Windows XP box. And we're going to start looking at those credentials. So on the bottom there, you can see the highlighted one. This is going to be that local administrator password hash that we were able to glean earlier. And we're going to do a quick search for PSExec. If anybody is going to use this in framework, it's exploit/Windows/SMB/PSExec. And if you're using the UI, the web UI, the URL that's listed actually has that module string right into the URL so that you can copy paste that into the framework if you aren't using the web UI. And then we're going to go into the PSExec module. And we can actually define different ranges. So if we know we have a scope out there and we know that we've got a good number of systems, the probability is that we're going to see other machines out there that actually have that same password. So we're going to populate a CIDR range. And then where we have the ability to import the SMB pass, we're going to put that hash instead. And then under SMB user, we're going to define administrator as obviously the user, because that's what we want to use. And eventually, all you have to do is click Run Exploit, and hopefully you're met with a Meterpreter session. Now, the nice thing about having Meterpreter is that you can run a lot of scripts. You can do direct interaction with that host, along with all kinds of anti-forensic and other stuff that you can do with that. But the ease of use for using Meterpreter for your sessions brings a lot of extra stuff into it. And it also allows you to directly interact with the command line on that host. So in particular, the command that I have on the bottom there, it's kind of hard to read. But that's shell. So we're going to inside of Meterpreter, we're going to define that we want that command to go directly into the command line on the host. And we're going to use the net command. So if you're not familiar with net commands, they're built into all the Windows devices. And we're going to do net user. In here, we're using Rapid7. The password, this is a secure password, right? Capital P, ASSWORD, number 1 asterisk. That's secure, right? Yeah, because it qualifies under all Windows requirements for secure passwords. If you use that and you put that against John the Ripper, that will last for about 2.5 seconds. So even though that is what's considered a secure password by most password standards, it will fall pretty quickly. And then we're going to do an add. So what we did was we just added that user. And then if we actually do a net local group, local group administrators, we can elevate that to a local administrator account real quick. And once we have local administrator on one of those machines, we can usually just jump right onto a remote session. So, and using remote desktop, we're able to directly interact with the Windows GUI and do whatever we want to. In this case, we found somebody that had a shared local administrator password that was also their Avaya box. So any of those voicemails or anything else, you can delete or change or whatever you need to do. So local admin, it's nice to have, but you're limited. You can't do a whole lot of things, right? So that's where incognito comes in. Anybody familiar with incognito? Got one hand, two hands, couple? Awesome. So if you're not familiar, incognito actually allows you to impersonate current domain sessions by integrating with the session by impersonating the domain user's token. So we're actually going to do a walkthrough here. Once we have an active session, and this can be a interpreter session based on an exploit, this can be a session that we generated by grabbing one of those hashes, doesn't matter. All we need is to make sure that we have a session on a domain host. Once we have that session on the domain host, we'll be able to see that things are actually executing. The little yellow line means that we have our session. And from there, we're going to drop into Meterpreter. So Meterpreter is, again, very interactive, and we're going to use the command use incognito. And what we're going to start doing is we're going to start looking at all of those connections that we may have, whether it's one, whether it's 1,000, to see who actually has, what host actually has a domain token on there. And what we're looking for specifically is we're looking for a domain admin. So if I've got incognito loaded and I'm on the host, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do a query to figure out who's in. Do I not have that? There we go. Oh, I'm just a slide ahead. Sorry. So if we do help, once you have incognito loaded, you can see all the options. In particular, we're going to look for that list _ tokens option, and then we're going to do a -u. By doing that, we're going to see exactly what hosts are on, or excuse me, what sessions and what users have an active session on that host. And the next thing that I'm going to do is so here we go. Here's our list tokens. And the last line underneath the delegation tokens, we can see that we have an administrator. And it's going to be the domain. So we have an R7 domain with an administrator account logged in here. Now that is obviously going to be a domain admin. If we need to actually take that a step further, we can start to look and do a net query for domain admins. It would be net group quotation domain admins and quotation / domain. And you can issue all of your net commands directly to whatever the closest DC is by adding that / domain to any of those net commands. And we can verify whether that administrator actually exists in there or not. But just understanding that we have an R7 / administrator, that's probably going to be a domain admin. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we're going to grab that session. And we use the command Impersonate Token. The Impersonate Token will then we also have to specify what token we want to use. So in the caveat for this is you actually have to make sure that you have a double backslash in between the domain and the user to interact with this. So like you can see on the bottom line, we have R7 // administrator. If you don't, that'll error out. I've run into that a lot of times. So it's a good thing to know. And if the stars align and everything works perfectly, we'll be presented with this. It'll say delegation token available and that we've successfully impersonated. Now, just because it says it doesn't mean that it's true. So we can do a get UID command from there, and it'll actually tell us who we're active, what the session is, and what user we're actually acting as. And then if we do this long string at the top, this execute -C -H, The old version of incognito, you could actually just type shell, but with the new caveats and some of the security controls that Windows have added, you actually have to use this whole string. And I'll make these slides available later, or you can get a hold of me and I'll give you this because it is kind of obnoxious to sit and read. But once we actually execute that, you can see that we're going to drop into the shell on that host. And when we have that information, everything we type into that interpreter line at the bottom will directly be interacted with in the shell session that we've just generated. So in particular, we're going to take a look and see who's our domain admins. So we can see that if we do that net group quotation domain admins / domain, it's going to do a query against that domain controller. And it's going to give us a list of everybody that exists in that domain or admins group. And in particular, we can see that we have administrator. Now, because we don't have the active credentials, we don't have a hash, we don't have anything like that for that domain admin, we can't really just spread from machine to machine with this session because we don't have any credentials to provide to other machines. So what's the next thing that we're going to do? Well, we're going to start adding users. Again, using net commands, we can use the net user. We're going to use the Rapid7 and that very strong password again. /add /domain. And if everything works correctly, we should see that the command has completed successfully. So now we've just added our user using that session as the domain admin to the domain. And if anybody is worried about auditing and everything, it was just created by that administrator user. So there is no log out there that says that it was created by someone that didn't have the proper permissions or anything else. You just created it with an already domain administrator account. Next thing is to make sure that we are part of the domain admins, because what else would you want, right? So if we do the net group domain admins, Rapid7, that's our user, /add /domain, now again we're going to issue that command to the DC, and if everything works properly, you should again see that line right in the middle of the screen. This command is completed successfully. So now all of a sudden we've already moved from A to B. We had one exploit that we were able to gain a foothold in the network, and now we have a domain admin account. Well, supposedly we do. It says it completed properly, but there's only one way to verify that. Let's query the domain admins group again. So at the bottom there, you can see that instead of just having administrator listed, we also have that Rapid7 username listed, and we are now officially part of the domain admins group. Now, to make sure that and see just how far that actually gives us leverage, we're going to go back to our PSExec module. And by doing that, we're going to use that same Rapid7 password 1 asterisk, and instead of defining it as workgroup, we're going to make sure that we put our domain in there, because if we have a domain admin, we should be able to connect to anything in the domain. And the next slide here, this one was one that I actually did out there, 496 connections after that. So 496 Metasploit sessions off of that one set of credentials that I was able to add. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of connections. I have, yep.
You say you got that because they all use the same simple password?
No, so this is, we're long past that password. So what we did is here, we've actually created our own user inside the domain and a domain admin. So once we have that domain admin, now we know what the password is, we know the user, we know the domain. And then if we use that PSExec, and again, it doesn't matter whether you use the web UI or if you're doing this from the framework command line, you're going to start generating sessions across every machine that domain that's connected to the domain and has the ability to allow that domain admin to log into. So once you have that, obviously you have full control over the domain. Next part is hardware, right? Hardware safe. Well, if we go back to the man in the middle session, like I had touched about before, Kane Enable will actually pull out any sort of SSH connections, telnet sessions, anything that it can read, and copy that into a clear text file for you. So you can go through that later and make sure that you're actually, you can see whether there's logins, you can gain access to switches, routers, firewalls, things like that. So, and then everybody trusts every one of their contractors, right? You trust them everywhere they go. So the next part is actually getting physical access. Now, I had a gentleman that stopped me when I did this before and said, well, we have pre-boot authentication. And my question was, how many desktops do you have it on? Everybody puts it on their laptops, but doesn't generally deploy that internally to those desktops because they don't move anywhere, right? But how many people can walk by? The ease to put a unauthorized OS onto a USB drive now and get those past physical security is almost minimal. They have, and I actually use one for social engineering, they have a fake quarter that you can actually split in half, put a micro SD card in, put that in your pocket with your change, pass that through as your change, and then you have the little micro SD card reader on your keychain because they're only about that big now. So this is one of the older readers. This isn't a big, bulky one. But on there, we have Backtrack 5. So once you have Backtrack 5 on there, and say either, and the next exploit that we're going to use, you can actually use if you have remote access and say you're doing a two-faceted pen test where you have one person external, you have one person internal, or you just don't want anybody to walk by and see the big dragon sitting on the screen and go, huh, that doesn't look like Windows. What you can do is you can actually go through the process of mounting that hard drive. And when you mount it, you can have access to that SAM database. You can have access to a lot of information on there. But you're still going to be in that terminal, or you're going to be on the session with a big Backtrack 5 logo or a Backtrack logo on the background. If anybody walks by, they're going to notice that. So what I usually do is I'll replace sethc.exe with command.exe. Anybody familiar with sethc.exe? No? That is your sticky keys, your hotkeys executable. Now, what's awesome about that is that if you replace that, obviously, create a backup or .old or something with the original. But if you go to the login screen and you hit Shift 5 times to bring up that sticky keys menu, now you're going to actually get presented with a command line. And this is running with system level permissions. So now you've just rebooted. You can open up the command prompt, use your net commands, and now you can add net users or whatever you need to, all from the login screen. So in the background, this is a Windows 2008 box, and it's unauthenticated when you hit Shift 5 times. So it's a cool little fun thing, and if you actually show a client that in video, it gives them a moment. So. The next thing is to take an understanding and look at this and actually start looking at how to keep going and how to keep looking at these things for more information. In particular, one of the really good free resources online is the Offensive Security Metasploit Unleashed tutorial. It's a whole walkthrough, and it's a hands-on engagement. It's a hands-on learning utility for learning Metasploit as a whole. They go through a lot of different things. It's a great resource. Community.rapid7.com has kind of taken over from some of the old Metasploit community stuff. So a lot of the Metasploit input is all on the community site now. So people will donate code. They will put scripts up there. They will put a lot of information, things that they've run into, things to look out for, up there for you to read later. SecurityBSides.com. You're at one now. Look for them. Take part in them. Be up here. I want to come and see you guys actually talking instead of me listen to me drone through this stuff up here. And then Metasploit, the Penetration Tester's Guide. Awesome book. If anybody's familiar, Dave Kennedy, Relic. Very, 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 very good book. I've read it a number of times and still continue to pick stuff up. And then your local DC DEF CON groups. Anybody familiar with DC groups? Cool. Take part in them. These are the guys that are actually out there in the trenches. These are the guys that are working through this stuff. They have their hands on this stuff every day. They're always coming up with stuff. This is a great place to actually find information, get more detail, go out and learn how to pick locks, go out and learn how to just talk InfoSec and start to actually leverage the ability from maybe if you're looking for a position in pen testing, you might be able to meet somebody that's looking to hire somebody in pen testing. And then the local hackerspace. Everybody familiar with hackerspaces? Anybody? Cool. They're all over the world. So you can find hackerspaces from here to Vienna to New York to everywhere around the world. There's hackerspaces out there. And cool places, again, to go and meet people. The big thing is making sure that you're networking. The keynote this morning touched upon it. Networking with the people that you don't know or that you aren't in your normal circle is key to making sure that not only does your career grow, but your information, your knowledge, and everything grows. And and it really is knowledge is power. So the whole thing to take away from this is, look at things from start to finish, but make it small pieces. Look at the little things and then connect those along the way. Because if you all of a sudden have a huge infrastructure, you have huge scope, and you have a huge engagement to do, you're not going to actively be able to function if it's all one big piece. Break that out, understand the little bits and pieces that will get you from A to B, and you will have domain admin in no time. So, anybody questions? Yep.
So if I'm looking to hire a pen tester,
Sure.
Sounds like all they got to know is these tools. How do I determine somebody who's a tool user doesn't know anything else?
And that's when you want to actually start. I do a secondary version of this presentation, which is an Auditors Introduction. And it goes into more about knowing the people. This is more like the technical talk. But you really want to make sure that you create a relationship with your pen tester. Don't only interview the company that is going to bring that pen tester on, but try to interview that pen tester themselves. Because if he is only as good as the tool, then he's only as good as the tool. And you'll find that out real quick by just talking to them. If they can tell you what Nmap is, and they can tell you what Metasploit is, and they can tell you what every other tool is, that's cool. But it doesn't break them out of the fact that it's still a tool that you're hiring. Make sure that, because especially as an organization, that pen tester is going to have access to data that you don't want people to have access to. Interview them just as much as you would interview any vendor, any product supplier, anyone else, because they will be that employee essentially for you while they're on that engagement. And any good pen tester is not going to end that at the end of that engagement. They're going to make sure that you create that relationship, because later on you don't want somebody new that's touching your data every year, every 6 months, because then you start getting into the part of, what are they doing with that? Where are they taking it? Are they taking it? What are they doing with all that information after the fact? You really do want to create a strong relationship with whoever's doing that pen test, and making sure that you know them, they know you, and they know your objectives, and you know what their level of experience is by looking at those objectives and applying that mindset to more of than, okay, I can do that. Because if that's their response to everything, you're just buying a tool. In more sense of the word than just that. So anybody else? All right. So here's my contact information. If you guys have any questions later on, if you want any information, if you want to add me on Twitter, feel free. Yeah, I try to answer this stuff as quickly as possible. I make myself available, especially to community members, for whatever you guys run into in the future. So thank you very much. That's my spiel.